Good evening. We are in the book of Isaiah, and we left off last time in Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah chapter 1. I'm hoping to finish this chapter tonight and maybe get a little bit more into the second chapter. And the whole point of this first chapter of Isaiah is to look at this arraignment, if you will, that God makes against the people of Israel. And he describes, first of all, their sinful condition, their present sinful situation of rebellious sons. And in verses 10 through 20, he has kind of a section where he describes what he wants them to do. He doesn't want them to offer false worship and empty ritualism. He wants them to cease evil and do good. He wants them to seek justice, reprove the ruthless, defend the orphan, and plead for the widow. And God basically tells them, he says, you've come into my assembly, you're spreading out your hands in prayer, and those same hands are covered with blood. There's a hypocrisy that's taking place here. And so he calls on them, let's reason together. Wash yourselves. Let's make you white as snow, he says. The big if is given in verses 19 and 20. If you consent and obey, you will eat the best of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, you will be devoured by the sword. Truly the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Now verses 21 through 31, which we'll read again in a moment, describe God's response to their whole rebellious situation. He kind of goes back into a circle. So a lot of times you'll see the prophets do this. They'll return to an earlier subject and they'll kind of walk around in circles a little bit around what they're talking about. And that's the case here. In verse 21, how the faithful city has become a harlot. She who was full of justice. Righteousness once lodged in her, but now murderers. Your silver has become dross. Your drink diluted with water. Your rulers are rebels and companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and chases after rewards. They do not defend the orphan, nor does the widow's plea come before them. Therefore, the Lord God of hosts, the mighty one of Israel, declares, I will be relieved of my adversaries and avenge myself on my foes. I will also turn my hand against you and will smelt away your dross as with lye and will remove all your alloy. Then I will restore your judges as at the first and your counselors as at the beginning. After that, you will be called the city of righteousness, a faithful city. Zion will be redeemed with justice, and her repentant ones with righteousness. But transgressors and sinners will be crushed together, and those who forsake the Lord will come to an end. Surely you will be ashamed of the oaks which you have desired. You will be embarrassed at the gardens which you have chosen. For you will be like an oak whose leaf fades away, or a garden that has no water. The strong man will become tinder, his work also a spark. Thus they shall both burn together, and there will be none to quench them. Now what would you say those verses are meant to show us that we just read? What is the point of that passage? He's not going to take it anymore. Okay. He starts out by describing their rebellion. Then what he's going to do about it, their judgment. But is that the end of the story?
Well, he's saying, essentially, how to put this. Essentially, he's saying that the majority of the people have gone after idolatry. Basically, the faithful wife has become a harlot. But he's indicating here that there is a remnant, a small minority of people that have remained faithful. And so these judgments that he's going to bring on Judah and Israel are meant to get the slag out, as it were. Okay. Smelt away the dross is how you heat up the metal and you blow air through it and you blow all the impurities out of it and make it pure. Yeah. He's going to get rid of all the evil people, and what's going to be left are his righteous remnant. No, that's a good explanation of what it says in verse 22. Your silver's become dross, your drink diluted with water. Well, what are we going to do? We got to get all the impurities out. We got to undilute the drink, if you will. He talked a little bit about this remnant concept back in verse 9. Unless the Lord of hosts had left us a few survivors, we would be like Sodom, we would be like Gomorrah. And Isaiah's going to have a lot more to say about the remnant later on in the book. It's important to note that as we go throughout, but I am planning to get a little more in-depth with it when we get to chapter 10 in particular, and what God says there. Okay, he shows their progression from rebellion to judgment, but verses 27 through 31 talk about what? Verses 27 through 31
tribes.
His judgments upon them are going to bring some of the people back to a state of repentance.
Okay.
And they're going to return to Him, and God is going to treat them basically with kindness and well.
Right. So we have redemption kind of going on here. Zion will be redeemed with justice, and her repentant ones with righteousness. It's not everybody in the city is just going to be unequivocally redeemed. It's just the repentant ones, it says in verse 27. And as opposed to the transgressors and the sinners, they're going to be crushed. Basically, the chapter ends kind of on a message of hope, if you will. Even though there's a judgment attached to it, there's also hope for those who are faithful to God. Gail.
Then unquenchable burning must not mean what I think.
Well, unquenchable burning is...
Very judgmental.
Well, no, that's two sides of the same coin. That's a good point to bring out. But frequently, Isaiah will... You cannot have the salvation of the righteous without also having the judgment on the wicked. And in fact, the book of Isaiah ends this way altogether. In chapter 66, for instance, Isaiah kind of does a similar thing. Really, it's kind of a way of pointing all the way back to the beginning. In verses 20 through 24 of Isaiah 66, it says, "Just as the new heavens and the new earth which I make will endure before me, declares the Lord, so your offspring and your name will endure. And it shall be from new moon to new moon, and from Sabbath to Sabbath. All mankind will come down to bow before me, says the Lord." That sounds pretty hopeful, doesn't it? But the very next verse, "Then they will go forth and look on the corpses of the men who have transgressed against me, for their worm will not die, and their fire will not be quenched, and they will be an abhorrence to all mankind." So you see that the blessing of God goes hand in hand with the judgment on the wicked. We kind of have this feel-good mentality that's attached to us because of our popular media and everything that people want to throw at us. But the fact of the matter is almost every passage in the Bible that talks about the salvation of the righteous and the glory that comes with the final judgment, well, there's always a second side of that too. It's like in Revelation. Revelation 21 describes the new heavens and the new earth, and there's going to wipe away all tears from every eye, and there's going to be no longer sorrow or pain or crying or death. And what does he say in verse 8? "But as for the cowardly and the immoral and the abominable and the adulterers and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone," which is the second death. That's included as part of that picture. The elimination of those who rebelled, the elimination of those who were wicked, is included in that picture of God's redemption and glorification. Now, he starts out, he calls the faithful city a harlot. And there's a sharp contrast here. We once had a faithful city, but now she's a harlot. She's a prostitute. We once had righteousness, but now we have murderers. We once had silver, but now we have dross or impurities. We once had something to drink, but that's become diluted. Ever try to drink something that's diluted with water? It doesn't taste very good. We give stuff like that to my son all the time because he's younger and he can't take juices quite the way we can. I don't enjoy drinking that stuff. He likes it, but I don't because it's diluted. The rulers become rebels. And there's a sharp contrast with what comes before with this harlotry and the injustice that takes place. You'll notice in verse 23, he says that they do not defend the orphan and the widow's plea does not come before them. Does that remind us of anything we read earlier? In the same chapter?
Verse 17.
Aha! He told them, defend the orphan and plead for the widow. But these things are not being done right now, are they? God says. No, they are not doing these things. Therefore, the faithful city is a harlot.
And Moses gave them that specifically as a command.
Right.
They were not to tread on these people, but that they were to help them. They were their brethren.
Yeah, the prophets frequently... the Old Testament in general uses orphans and widows as kind of a test case of societal injustice. A good example of that is in Exodus chapter 22, for instance. Whenever God gives Israel the law at Mount Sinai, in Exodus 22, beginning in verse 22, "You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. If you afflict him at all, and he does cry out to me, I will surely hear his cry. My anger will be kindled, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless." So either you treat the orphan and the widow correctly, God says, or I'm going to turn your family into orphans and widows. It's the principle of equal retribution there. Now this is the result of a failure to trust God. It leads to everybody trusting in themselves, leads to everybody being self-centered, leads to total collapse of civilization. And so in verses 24 through 26, the point is once again what God is going to do about it. I will be relieved. I will turn my hand against you. Verse 25. Then I will restore your judges. Verse 26. There's kind of a little wordplay going on here, and I don't know, the English versions may not all carry this across. But in verse 25 he says, I will turn my hand against you. And in verse 26 he says, I will restore, I will return your judges as at the first. Those are actually the same word. He says, first I'm going to turn my hand against you and destroy you. Then I'm going to turn you back into this state that you're supposed to be at. Verse 26. And the goal of God's actions is to produce a faithful city. Oh, where did we see that before? Faithful city. Yeah, that's how he started this section, right? The faithful city has become a harlot, and she's done all these things, and this is what I'm going to do to her so that she will become a faithful city. You see how Isaiah comes full circle to bring them back to their initial state. That's God's goal, really, when you think about it. Humanity was in the Garden of Eden with God. They were in a position of faithfulness and trust, and they fell. They got involved in sin, and now God has been through this long process and cycle of deliverance and rebellion and redemption to bring us back to the beginning, to that state of faithfulness with God, that redeemed state that is, that fellowship with God that mankind has always needed. In verses 27 through 31, and actually, I have a question here. What are the two main things being contrasted? But Gail kind of already got at it already. It's between those that God saves and those that God destroys. Zion is redeemed with justice and righteousness. The things that once dwelled in that city now dwell in her again. Verse 21, she was once full of justice and righteousness, but now she's full of murderers and she's a harlot. But in verse 27, he says that she will be redeemed with justice and righteousness. There's that pair of words that comes back. Isaiah has once again come full circle. But only those who pursue the justice and the righteousness, only those who are repentant will get to taste the benefits of this. Transgressors and sinners will be crushed together, verse 28. The rebellion of verses 2 through 4 is brought to its inevitable conclusion. He says that you will be ashamed of the oaks that you have chosen. What's that a reference to? Idol, yeah, probably a reference to the idols they're worshiping. The people set up altars on every high place, under every green tree. Throughout the book of Isaiah, we're going to see this just kind of throughout as we go, but trees are become a symbol of the perceived power, a symbol of pride, especially in chapter 2, verse 13, that God talks about the lofty cedars and the oaks of Bashan and the lofty mountains, and how all these high things that are so exalted, and how God's going to humiliate them and destroy them. Well, he's not talking about literal trees and literal mountains. The trees and the mountains didn't do anything wrong in and of themselves. It's the people who are like those things, who think so highly of themselves that they become like trees and mountains, that have become so lofty and exalted. God says, no, I'm going to destroy you. I will have a day of reckoning against you, God says. Instead of choosing the place that God chose for worship in Deuteronomy 12, they chose the oaks for their worship. They chose to worship the trees instead of the God who made the trees. And as a result of that, what happened? Well, if they're worshiping the trees, what do they become like? They become like the trees. Verse 30, you will be like an oak whose leaf fades away. This is an Old Testament principle all over the place. You become what you worship. In verse 29, you will be ashamed of the oaks you've chosen. He says in verse 30, you will be like an oak. In the 115th Psalm, we have kind of an example of this type of thing right here. The psalmist writes a satire against idolatry. People, you are what you worship, they say. Well, why should the nation say, where's their God? Verse 3, our God is in the heavens. He does whatever He pleases. Verse 4, their idols are silver and gold, the works of man's hands. They have mouths, but they cannot speak. They have eyes, but they cannot see. They have ears, but they cannot hear. They have noses, but they cannot smell. They have hands, but they cannot feel. They have feet, but they cannot walk. They cannot make a sound with their throat. Those who make them will become like them. Everyone who trusts in them. That's the principle there. If you worship these idols, you will become like them. If you worship these non-living, dead idols that can't see or hear or talk or do any of these other things, you're going to become like that. You're going to become a person who can't see or hear or talk. You're going to become a person who is a non-living thing. You will be like these oaks. And one of the great characteristics of oaks is how flammable they are. So in verse 30, describes the oak who fades away, and the strong man, verse 31, will become tinder, his work a spark, and they shall burn together, and there will be none to quench them. For all their efforts, for all their strong arms, they will be found worthless and combustible. The idol maker shall burn with his work, and there will be none to quench them. So that's the conclusion of chapter 1. This is the mess that Israel's in. How do we get them out of it? And what's going to happen if they don't? In some ways, this chapter is kind of a miniature version of the whole book's argument, that a snapshot of what is to come. But it's not just written for the benefit of the 8th century Israelites, it's written for our benefit as well, so that we might understand what the judgment of God is like. What happens to those who rebel against Him and reject Him, and what happens to those who trust in Him, who cease from evil and learn to do good. Any comments or questions to the end of chapter 1? Tom?
It's the same in your Bible.
Verse 27, yes. Yeah. Well, Zion is one of the words for Jerusalem. Mount Zion is typically described in that sense. Some people talk about, Zion being a figure for, the Messianic kingdom and all that. It's originally a geographic location where the city of Jerusalem was built, but it came to mean a lot more than that as the Bible story unfolds. And actually, we're gonna see that even in chapter 2, how Zion becomes sort of the focal point for where God's restoration comes from. Zion, I don't know exactly what your question was getting at, but
That question, I guess. When will all this take place?
well,
An enemy nation and
this is as good a time as any, I guess, to talk about prophetic fulfillment. Actually, chalkboard's way over here. I'm going to bring this over. I hadn't anticipated having to draw on it tonight, but I got it. All right. And we're going to see this in a moment, actually, in chapter 2, kind of as the discussion. But we'll picture the prophet kind of standing here. And the prophet's a stick figure. I have to appreciate my artistic skills. All right. And you got this series of mountains, these peaks and these troughs. Now the prophet sees events taking place ahead of time. This is what they refer to as prophetic telescoping, if you will. What happens is the prophet will see one fulfillment of an event that's very close and very imminent, and then another event could fulfill the same prophecy that's very close and that's a little bit further off, and yet another fulfillment could be yet an even further off fulfillment of what's taking place. There might be something even at the end of time that fits this. But the prophet doesn't see the chronological separation between them in these fulfillments. In the same way that you don't see how much distance there are between the peaks of these mountains. You just see the landscape laid out before you. That's what the Old Testament prophecies are like, kind of. If we don't see, in Isaiah's day, he's talking about something that's happening right now. He's talking about an Assyrian crisis that's going on in Jerusalem. The Assyrians are going to come and they're going to wage war against the city. Now, in this instance here, Jerusalem's actually delivered in the book of Isaiah. Hezekiah, he turns to the Lord, he trusts in the Lord, and Sennacherib's army is defeated. And Jerusalem is delivered. And in that way, Zion is redeemed with justice. But later on, the city gets destroyed. And they get destroyed by the Babylonians in 587. And you might say that after they came back from captivity and rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, that was another instance where Zion was redeemed with justice. And there's kind of a fulfillment. But then we might also say that Zion is not just limited to the city of Zion. There's some kind of symbolic fulfillment in the church itself. The Hebrew author draws a connection with Mount Zion being the church of the living God in Hebrews chapter 12. In Hebrews chapter 12, he says, That you've not come to a mountain that can be touched with blazing fire, into darkness and gloom and whirlwind, and to the blast of a trumpet and the sound of words, which sound was such that those who heard begged no further word be spoken to them. For they could not bear the command, if even a beast touches the mountain, it will be stoned. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I am full of fear and trembling. But you have come to Mount Zion. In other words, we are part of this community of Mount Zion. And to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to myriads of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood which speaks better than the blood of Abel. So there's a sense then in which he talks about Zion being redeemed. He is also talking about the church could be seen as a fulfillment of that. The New Testament draws all that connection. Gail, you have something?
Was it Jerusalem redeemed with justice? The first Christians existed there?
Yeah, well, there's a sense in which, and we're going to actually.
That's where the gospel started. That's where it began.
This provides me kind of the perfect segue into chapter 2. The word which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. It will come about that in the last days the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it, and many peoples will come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations, and will render decisions for many peoples. They will hammer their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. Now, if there's any text that you got to know to really understand some of the messages of the book of Isaiah, this is really important. These 4 verses right here, the mountain of the house of the Lord. I would say this is one of I don't know what the most important passage in the book is. That's kind of a hard one to choose. But this is one of the most important. So remember chapter 2, because I will constantly refer back to it throughout this class. The words from this chapter actually appear in Micah chapter 4 verses 1 through 3. And it's almost an identical parallel. And people will argue forever about which one wrote first. And I have no idea which one wrote first, and I don't think it matters. But there's a sudden shift here. Chapter 1's talking about judgment, and all of a sudden Isaiah starts talking about how there's going to be a glorious mountain of the Lord, and it's going to be the chief of the mountains, the head of the mountains. Begs the question, how can that Israel in chapter 1 become the Israel of chapter 2 here? He talks about the last days. The last days is just a generic time reference. It's used all over the Old Testament to refer to something that's a long way off. For instance, in Genesis 49, when Jacob blesses his sons, he says, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen to you in the last days, or the latter days. It's the same expression in Hebrew. In Numbers 24, whenever Balaam prophesies about the morning star, the king that's going to come up out of Israel, he uses this expression, this is what's going to happen in the latter days, the last days. Deuteronomy uses it several places, Hosea uses it. Peter uses the expression in Acts 2:17. When he quotes from Joel 2, he says that this is what's going to happen in the last days. The Lord will pour out His Spirit on all mankind, or on all flesh. The last days is a little bit of a misleading translation, because it makes you think, oh, that's like right at the end of the world. That'll be the last week of planet Earth's existence or something. No, that's not what that means, because events have been fulfilled in that context, and the Earth's still here. It does not tell us when this is going to happen either. It doesn't tell us how much time elapses between prophecy and fulfillment. It just tells us that this is happening after this, or at a later time, is what it means. He describes the mountain of the house of the Lord, the mountain of the house of Yahweh. Well, what's that? Which mountain are we talking about here? Well, yeah, Mount Zion, right? And he uses a couple different terms interchangeably: the mountain of the Lord, the house of the God of Jacob, Zion, Jerusalem. He uses all those terms interchangeably in this passage, so it's safe to say they're one and the same. And mountains, you think about it, mountains are frequently connected with God's presence. In Exodus 19, where did they go to see God? They went to Mount Sinai. In Isaiah chapter 4, we find out that Mount Zion is going to become a place of glory. In Isaiah 4, verses 2 through 6, kind of the parallel passage to this. In that day, the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth will be the pride and adornment of the survivors of Israel. It will come about that he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone who is recorded for life in Jerusalem. When the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and purged the bloodshed of Jerusalem from her midst by the spirit of judgment and the spirit of burning, then the Lord will create over the whole area of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day, even smoke, and the brightness of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory will be a canopy. There will be a shelter to give shade from the heat by day, and refuge and protection from the storm and rain. That's a description of what's going to happen at Mount Zion. Cloud by day, fire by night. And if you know anything about the Old Testament Israel, you'll know the cloud by day and the fire by night is what? That's the form God took when He led them out of Egypt. That's God's presence among His people right there. This is God saying that He will be that over Mount Zion. Now chapter 2, we've got this mountain of the house of the Lord, the mountain, Mount Zion, the city of God. We already read Hebrews 12, which talks about how you have come to Mount Zion. The Hebrew author may be alluding to this passage a little bit in talking about that mountain of the house of the Lord. And what happens at this mountain? What do they do at this mountain? Just going to all gather around the mountain and do what? They'll learn. They will teach. They will come to this mountain to be taught by God. That language is later used in Isaiah 54 in verse 13 to talk about the new covenant age. Later on in the chapter, we see that Israel is being wrongly taught by foreigners. But here, God says that they will come to this mountain to be taught by God. Part of the new covenant that God makes with Israel is this idea that the law would be written on their hearts. They will no longer teach each man his brother and each man his neighbor, saying, "Know the Lord, because they will all know me," God says. And you see kind of this thing going on where many nations will gather to the mountain. Many peoples will gather to the mountain. Who are these nations? Just a select, elite few that... Unbelievers? They come... Now believers might be a better way of putting it. These are people who gather. It's not just the Jewish people, nations. Sometimes the word can also be translated Gentiles. Many peoples come to it. Isaiah talks about this quite a bit. There's this gathering of the nations at Jerusalem to come and learn from God, to come and be part of the new covenant people. God is breaking down a dividing wall between the Jews and the Gentiles and bringing them together to make them into one people and to have one king over them. And to be gathered at one mighty mountain, which is the church of the living God. People come to Zion, and the law goes forth from Zion. Now, there's a sense in which, you get to Pentecost, and you got Jews gathered there from every nation under heaven. They're all gathered together, and they see the outpouring of the Spirit. They hear the teaching of Christ proclaimed. They form a congregation of 3,000 people there in Jerusalem. And that congregation gets larger and larger until eventually they are persecuted and they have to go out and they have to spread out teaching the Word. So in that sense, you could say that the law went forth from Zion on that occasion. What we see here is that but there's a sense in which this is also more symbolically fulfilled in the inclusion of the Gentiles as well. And then you get to verse 4, God will judge between the nations, render decisions for many people, and they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. What's that mean? Swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks. No more war. Well, yeah, that's the explanation that's given right here, right? Nation will not lift up sword against nation, never again will they learn war. You take the weapons of warfare, the swords and the spears, and you turn them into farming implements, basically. Plowshares, pruning hooks. There's no war permitted on the holy mountain. Now, we see the opposite image in the book of Joel, Joel chapter 3, when Joel is describing the day of the Lord and the day of judgment, he calls all the nations to gather into the valley of judgment for God to basically make war with them. And he tells them the opposite. He tells them, take your plowshares and your pruning hooks and hammer them back into swords and spears. You've got a battle to go fight. And of course they get there and they're annihilated by God. The battle isn't even so much described for us, so much as the fact that God wins. That's in Joel chapter 3. But here in Isaiah, he uses kind of the opposite language. And I hold that Isaiah was written before Joel, but I know that some people will dispute that. But what happens here is Isaiah basically declares an end to war and a declaration of peace. So that's kind of what we got going on here. Now, what's the purpose of this oracle? This mountain of the house of the Lord. When's it fulfilled? Well, we already talked about one instance of fulfillment. Well, yeah, there's a lot. All that's kind of connected into it. I guess the main thing that comes out here is one thing I think we need to avoid getting locked into is the idea that prophecy only has one possible fulfillment, because it's clearly there's examples of otherwise taking place throughout the Scripture. We think of the promise to David, for instance. Now that was Solomon. But it was also Jesus, and it's also us. And, all of these passages you can go to and look at and see the connection that's drawn there. So I think it is valid to see kind of there's probably more than one application for a prophecy here. Now, here's the interesting thing. This passage is not explicitly quoted anywhere in the New Testament. We're just kind of reading it and drawing the connections ourselves. And we're kind of seeing for ourselves that, that did happen at Pentecost. They did have that. They did, start teaching the new law from Mount Zion. They did start bringing in all these things. You can see it, but we're seeing it after the fact. Not one of us could have stood before the event at Pentecost and say, oh, well, that's obviously talking about Pentecost. But after the fact, we look back and we understand that the Scripture spoke about that event ahead of time and spoke about what was going to take place. Now, there is another sense in which this is also fulfilled in heaven, I think. Think about this. We got the mountain of God, Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem, and on the final day of judgment, who's going to be there? Who's going to be gathered there?
All the righteous.
Everybody's going to be gathered there. Some people will be gathered there for judgment. Some people will be gathered there for salvation. And there's going to be an end to all war. All the nations will be gathered. All God's people will be gathered into a unified nation. And never again will they learn war. Now, is war still going on today? Well, yeah, it is. So there's a sense in which, while within the church we are supposed to have peace in Christ even now, there's another sense in which the language of this prophecy appears to demand a even greater fulfillment that's ahead of us, does it not? So, once again, we have kind of this telescoping thing where we see an event where it may have, I don't know if they had a more imminent fulfillment in Isaiah's day or not. I couldn't point to it and tell you, but we had Pentecost, start of God's people, the church, and then we have a greater event even further down the horizon in which we have yet to see this prophecy realized in our own existence. When God makes His final return to gather His people to His holy mountain where we will remain for all eternity being taught by the Lord. Any thoughts on that or comments or questions? That's kind of a... I think this is I like this passage. It's one of the crucial passages to understanding the book, I think. Okay, well, if nothing else, verse 5, "Come, house of Jacob, and let us walk in the light of the Lord, for you have abandoned your people, the house of Jacob, because they are filled with influences from the east. They are soothsayers like the Philistines. They strike bargains with the children of foreigners. Their land has also been filled with silver and gold, and there is no end to their treasures. Their land has also been filled with horses, and there is no end to their chariots. The land has also been filled with idols. They worship the work of their hands, that which their fingers have made. So man has been humbled and mankind has been abased, but do not forgive them. Enter the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of His majesty. The proud look of man will be abased and the loftiness of man will be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day." Now, does that seem like a kind of a sudden change of subject to you? He starts talking about judgment again. And there's a series of contrasts between what he said in the first 4 verses and what he said in verses 5 through 11. In verse 3, the nations are gathered to learn from the Lord. But here, Israel's learning from the nations. They're filled with influences from the east. In verse 2, God's mountain is exalted. But in verses 9 and 11, Israel is seen exalting himself instead. In verse 4, the weapons are being removed for peace. But in verse 7, what happens? Well, their land is filled with horses and chariots, weapons of warfare once again. In verse 3, people come to the house of God. But in verse 6, what do we see? Well, you've abandoned your people. You've abandoned the house of Jacob. In verse 3, we have true worship at the house of the Lord, but in verse 8, we have idolatry. So there's this contrast between these two passages right here. What do we see? Anybody notice a repeated phrase throughout the passage we just read? Verses 5 through 11. The phrase that he just repeats over and over and over and over. Their land also has been what? Filled. Their land has been filled, yes. They are filled. What are they filled with? Various things. Are they good things? No. They're filled with influences from the east. Silver and gold, monetary gain basically. Horses and idols. They're filled with it. A couple times it repeats the phrase, there is no end. There's no end to their treasures. There's no end to their chariots. So here what we've got is a situation where the people are full. We think about fullness as being a good thing most of the time, but they're not full of good things, are they? They're full of things that God would rather them not be so full with. The nation is characterized by monetary wealth and materialism, by weaponry, by idolatry, influences from the east, perhaps more of a model of religious tolerance, you might say. In spite of the fact that divination and magic are forbidden in the law, well, we see this instance where they're filled with influences from the east. We really just want to let everybody in here. We kind of want to have a more pluralistic society where we can all share the different ideas about what we think God is. They're filled with influences from the east. And they're soothsayers like the Philistines. And they strike bargains with the children of foreigners. But is that a good thing? Well, no! God says that's not a good thing. They're filled and yet they are so empty. All of these items are in sharp contrast with what he said in verses 1 through 4. This picture of glorified Zion, every way that you are living is currently in contradiction to that, he says. It's a false fullness. Israel's full of all these human concerns, and yet they are ultimately an empty nation. Gail. Yeah. I advise you, that's a good, we're going to talk about that Sunday, I think, actually, but, you say, oh, I'm rich, I've become wealthy, I don't have any need, and you don't even see the depth of your own problem. The problem with Laodicea, we talk about being lukewarm, like they just kind of sat around. The worst part about their lukewarmness was the fact that they were totally oblivious to it. They thought they were special. They thought they were good people. They thought they were rich. And God said, you're so blind to your own needs. You're so blind to the fact that you are poor and wretched and miserable and blind and naked. That's what Israel's like. Oh, we're filled. We have all this stuff. God must be blessing us. God must really approve of what we're doing here because we've got all these wonderful things taking place. No, you don't. It says the land is filled with all these things. And so what we have here is the call to enter the rock, hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of His majesty. Hide under the rocks, he says. This is kind of a repeated thing that goes on throughout this chapter. And it's, we see the same kind of thing in the other prophets. We see the same kind of thing in Revelation chapter 6. Whenever God's judgment comes, people will try to hide from Him. Their fullness will not protect them then. They will try to hide from Him in the rocks and in the caves, and that will prove to be a futile exercise. Hiding from God's splendor, His glorious presence, will humble all who see Him. Humans do not have anything to boast about when they're faced with the judgment of the Almighty. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day, verse 11. Or, verse 12, the Lord of hosts will have a day of reckoning against everyone who is proud and lofty, against everyone who is lifted up, against that he may be abased. It will be against all the cedars of Lebanon that are lofty and lifted up, against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the lofty mountains, against all the hills that are lifted up, against every high tower, against every fortified wall, against all the ships of Tarshish, and against all the beautiful craft. The pride of man will be humbled, and the loftiness of men will be abased, and the Lord alone will be completely exalted in that day. Notice that verse 17 actually repeats verse 11. This is the dangers of false exaltation right here. Man has always had this problem of just thinking a little bit too highly of himself. Thinking a little bit more highly of himself than he ought to think. Exalting himself. But what does God say? The Lord alone will be exalted in that day. And in the last days, the mountain of the Lord will be exalted above all other mountains. There is coming a day when people will realize how they truly stand before God. There's coming a day when you and I will realize how we truly stand before God. May God help us to have some measure of perception as to just how infinitesimally small we are compared to Him, and how great He is compared to us. And may that humility be the basis for which we live our lives. We didn't get through chapter 2, but we'll pick up some more next time. So we'll have a little bit of a break, and then we'll turn it over with the songs and the short talk.